He was 22 when his father died, and the only thing he inherited was a problem no one else wanted. He didn't cry. He walked the fields instead, boots crunching over soil that hadn't seen real rain in weeks. In the shed, a tractor sat under a layer of dust, engine seized, exactly where his father had left it the last time it broke down, and he never had the money to fix it. 3 weeks later, a man in a clean suit knocked on the door and said it plainly. The loan on the land was overdue. If it wasn't paid by the end of the season, the bank would take everything. That night he sat at his father's desk, one bulb swinging overhead, staring at numbers that refused to make sense no matter how many times he added them. He decided anyway. He wasn't going to sell, and he wasn't going to lose it either. By 4 the next morning he was outside in the dark, feeding animals he could barely afford to keep alive. This part, at least, wasn't new. He'd been doing it since he was 6, trailing behind his father with 2 buckets too heavy for his arms, spilling half the water before he even reached the trough. Wake before the sun, feed the livestock, haul water, harvest under heat that didn't care whose land it was. He told himself if he just worked harder than everyone else, the debt would close the gap. So he pushed. Longer days, bigger harvests. He drove himself past the point his father ever had. It wasn't enough. The debt barely moved. Effort, it turned out, wasn't the same thing as leverage, a lesson that cost him almost a full year to learn. He learned it standing in a line. 3rd harvest, 4 farmers deep, waiting to sell. The man ahead of him had grown some of the best grain in the region. Everyone knew it. And he was still begging the buyer to take it at a price that barely covered seed and labor. Why would a man who grew grain that well beg for anything? Because the grain was already cut, sitting in sacks, losing value by the hour, and the buyer knew exactly how little time that farmer had left to hold out. He had no cards. He'd played them all the second he loaded the truck. Something in that exchange stuck to him the whole drive home. Not a plan yet, just a question that wouldn't let go.
What if the problem was never how much you grew? What if it was what you did in the days after you grew it?
He tested it small, almost too quietly to call it a plan. A neighbor, desperate to sell before his grain spoiled, took a cash offer on the spot. A little under market price, but immediate, no waiting in line. Relief mattered more to that man than the few dollars he was giving up. He didn't resell it. He patched an old barn into a storage room, sealed what he thought was every gap, and let the grain sit. He was wrong about the gaps. A late rain found the one section of roof he'd missed, and by the time he noticed, nearly a quarter of the grain had gone to mold. He stood in that barn at midnight, tearing open sacks by lantern light, watching weeks of work rot in his hands. He didn't quit. He rebuilt the roof properly this time, moved what was left to higher ground, and waited again. Slower, more careful, checking the barn every single day like it was one of the animals. When prices finally rose, he sold. Not for a small profit, for enough to cover what the mold had taken. Standing in the same market where he used to beg for a fair number, he was the one setting terms now. He wasn't just growing anymore, he was timing. The money that came in didn't buy anything that would impress a neighbor. No new truck sitting in the driveway. He drove out instead to a retiring farmer 2 properties over and offered to buy his land outright. The man said no. Told him flatly he'd rather let the field sit empty than sell to a boy who used to beg at the same market he did. He didn't argue. He left. 6 months later he came back with a better offer and a track record the man could no longer dismiss. That time, the answer was yes. Another farmer, buried in debt with no way out, sold for less than the land was worth because he needed cash immediately and no one else was offering it. Acre by acre, his 50 became something larger than he could walk in a single day. He hired his first real worker, a quiet man who needed steady pay more than he needed to own anything himself. He fixed the irrigation his father never had money to repair, watching water reach corners of the property that had been dry for a decade. New machines came next, tearing through work that used to take his family a week. Production climbed, then climbed again. He barely noticed how much of his life outside the farm had quietly disappeared. His evenings were spent at the same desk, alone, going over numbers long after there was any reason to still be awake. He told himself that was temporary. It didn't feel temporary. For a while, it felt like nothing could touch him. Then growth started outpacing his ability to control it. He was still running everything through himself. It started to crack. A delivery got missed because two workers each assumed the other had loaded the truck. A shipment sat unlogged in storage for a week, and nobody caught it until a buyer called asking where it was.
The mistakes weren't random. They were the same problem, repeating at a bigger scale, because he'd built the business without building anything underneath it to hold the weight. So he stopped hiring people for tasks and started hiring them for roles. One man took full authority over the fields, planting, harvest timing. Another took over storage, accountable for every sack in and out. A third took contracts and deliveries. For the first time, decisions were being made on his land that he hadn't made himself. He wrote it down. Who answered to who owned what. Rules that didn't depend on him remembering everything or being everywhere at once. It felt strange, at first, watching pieces of what used to live only in his head now living in other people's hands. But the missed deliveries stopped. The same mistakes stopped repeating themselves. He hadn't just built a bigger farm, he'd built something that could survive a day he wasn't there to run it, which was good, because the hardest test of everything he'd built was still coming. A large operation moved into the region. Real capital, modern machinery, enough scale to undercut prices across the entire area. Within weeks, buyers who used to drive straight to his gate stopped coming, chasing lower costs somewhere else. He sat at that same desk his father used to sit at, staring at numbers again, feeling the ground move under him for the first time in years. If he fought this on price, he already knew the ending. He didn't have the scale, he would lose. So he stopped looking at the fight in front of him and drove 3 hours to the city, to a supermarket chain that had never bought directly from a farmer his size. They turned him down flat, told him, without much interest, that they only worked with suppliers who could guarantee volume he couldn't promise. He didn't leave angry, he left with a list of everything they'd said he was missing. 3 months later, he came back. Real storage numbers, a delivery plan, 2 trucks already bought and sitting outside, ready to prove it rather than promise it. This time they listened. He offered them something the bigger competitor never thought to build. A guarantee, same delivery, same day, every week, regardless of weather or harvest. They were still skeptical. He proved it the following month, delivering exactly on time without being asked twice. The competitor could still sell grain cheaper than he could, but they couldn't sell certainty. And it turned out certainty was worth more to a supermarket buyer than a price that occasionally broke its promise. Contract by contract, he built the one thing the new competitor never bothered to build: reliability, with a face attached to it. The wins kept coming, but most nights he still ate dinner alone, in a house that had gotten bigger every year while the rest of his life had gotten smaller. He told himself there would be time for that later. There was always more land, more contracts, more to build first.